BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Come on in and get comfy. This is Seriously from BBC Radio 4, and I'm Vanessa Kasile. This podcast brings you true stories for curious minds and wild imaginations. Here comes something unusual, charming, and seriously fascinating.
Thames. Thamesis. The T. Just the consonant T. So we have Tamar, we have Tame, we have Thames. So many rivers across Europe have that T consonant. And the T and the Da are kind of interchangeable. So there you think of the D, and you think of the Danube. And therefore the goddess Danu, this watery all-mother of the pre-Christian traditions, this goddess Danu.
This is a map of a river. A map of the River Thames. One made of stories, songs and folklore. I'm Sam Lee, song collector, river pilgrim and your mapmaker. And we're beginning our journey here, Thames Head in Gloucestershire, with the voice of my friend, storyteller, mead maker and Druid, Chris Park.
Many rivers are given goddess-like names. And how the Thames got that association with being Father Thames, I'm not quite sure. That lovely reclining figure with a sort of fishy beard and the paddle in his hand.
We're standing together in a cloudburst, soaking us to the skin, drumming on the microphone. And by my feet, a modest pile of stones marks where hydrologists and geographers of old decided Father Thames is born, rising invisibly from somewhere below our feet. This is the start of a pilgrimage for me, between here and the Thames estuary, 215 miles away. I'm charting some of the cultural tributaries which become soluble within this mighty river. How does the Thames become saturated with the memories and meanings, songs and stories offered by the people I'll be meeting? I want to show how inextricably we are connected to the rivers that flow through our lives.
Spring is our birth, and springs are like vulvas. A vulva in the landscape where life is born. The water that comes out of the ground at these springs is pure, like a newborn child. I think we relate to rivers like we relate to our own lives. You know, throughout the whole world, where we find water and springs, we find hydrolatry. Prayer and offerings have been made at springs.
Wassail, wassail all over this town. Our toast it is white and our ale it is brown. Our bowl it is made of the maplin tree, and so good beer and the best barley. Well, Chris, it feels immensely appropriate. Just as we come to start our blessing of the source, the rain has just stopped. The sun is sparked back up again, and there was this extraordinary rainbow. Is that a sign?
I think this is the moment to make our prayer and give thanks to this great river that just binds culture all the way along towns and the cities and the villages and those lovely pubs by all those bridges. So much life all the way along, and of course death and everything in between. But here we are at the birth of this river. This is sacred space, and we honour you and we give our humble thanks.
Here's to the ox and to his long horn. May God send our masters a good crop of corn, a good crop of corn and another of hay, to pass the cold wintry winds away.
Alfred Williams named this song. He named it the Thames Head Wassailer's Song because he only heard it around this area. A bit further northwards, a bit further southwards, you'd have a different wassailer's song. Wassailing was done, for apple trees, for cattle, for corn, and maybe they were wassailing here for health and vigour and fecundity of the river.
I wonder how much of that song will carry down into the groundwater.
Feel them moving underground, can't you? You can to sort of feel these waters moving that direction to slowly fill up the upper reaches and then take their glorious journey eastwards.
So we'll follow that flow, mapping south and east along the river. The next landfall is in the still rural western outskirts of Reading, at the houseboat of illustrator, activist and author of the Book of Trespass, Nick Hayes.
It was early one morning, Billy Henry arose, straight to his comrade's bedchamber he goes. Rise up, beloved comrade, let nobody know. It's a bright sunny morning when a bathing will go. The river is all about connectivity. It does connect Lechlade to Tower Bridge. There you are right at the back of your boat, at the tiller, and if you live on it, you've literally got your life in a box ahead of you. What you can see is your future. One of the most glorious things about this river is that it is a kind of commons. Everybody comes together and they have their own way of engaging with the river. Early morning, you're going to get the public school boys going down on their rowing boats. Then you'll get your teenage lads that have got just a little outboard motor. They'll usually have a couple of fishing rods and a 12-pack of beer. Then you've got paddleboarders, almost like Jesus walking on water. There's no one kind of paddleboarder, elderly women to 5-year-old children with their parents, and everyone in between, paddling for the pleasure of it, just as another way of being in or on or around the river. Him and his comrade, they went down that lane. And the first one they met was the keeper of game. He says, turn back, beloved comrades, do not venture in. Deep and dark waters in the lakes of the Thames. There we go. That's it.
You paint this picture of the Thames now as these glorious riverbanks, free passage and trees and a sort of libertarian attitude that the river is ours. Does that belie a more uncomfortable truth? Or is this bit of the River Thames actually very permissive in that respect?
Since about the mid-1700s, the general public had a right to navigate and to access the Thames. However, the Thames is only one of 3% of rivers in England that the public have rights of access to, and the rest we're just categorically banned from. If you're unlucky, you'll meet the river bailiff or the fishermen that have rented exclusive access, and more often than not you'll be met with a kind of level of aggression that is entirely incongruous to the whole reason you want to come to the river. Well, down come his mother like one in despair. She's a ring in her hands and a tear in her hair. Raised up a family of 6 fine young men, and the best of them's drowned on the banks of the Thames. We need blue space, as it's called, for our mental health, for our physical health. Areas of England that are most accessible. We should open those up to a responsible right of access, that very old concept of the commons. And with that right of access would come a much greater clarity on what it was that we owed, not just the environment, but also to the people that own it and the people that work with it. Just like the campaigners up in Ilkley with the River Wharf. With a 2-year campaign, they were just able to be awarded that area of the River Wharf with the first EU bathing status in England of inland waterways. No other river is monitored to the extent of the River Wharf because of these local commoners in Ilkley claiming their right of access and saying, we want to swim here, so the river water needs to be of a standard that it doesn't poison us.
As with so much of the natural world, it is personal connection and direct knowing, an individual and community love that encourages good custodianship. Between 1604 and 1914, Parliament enacted, through thousands of different enclosure bills, a transferring of over 6.5 million acres, or around 1/5 of England, from common to private ownership. This basically locked out common people from accessing the land.
When enclosure came along, when we were actually forced out of the countryside and we lost our rights of access, we also lost our right to protect nature. So it's no wonder that we've forgotten that it is our responsibility. No one else is going to take that responsibility. It's down to the people that love it. And I think with all of those changes will come a more subtle change in society, that we're less reliant on goods that are made out of plastic to entertain us and more entwined with this world that we seem to have forgotten, which is the natural world.
So the Thames flows on through an increasingly urban landscape. And the next time we see him, he's widened, tidal, and channeled between high stone embankments. We're in the middle of London, walking the foreshore with Debbie Leach from the river protection charity Thames 21. Thames 21 cares for the health of the river and his tributaries as he flows through London, cleaning, speaking out for, and getting local communities close to the river in a way that would have been normal throughout most of the city's history.
A couple of hundred years ago, it would be quite different if you were looking out at this scene. There'd be none of these hard embankments. You'd find lots of jetties, buildings going out over the water. You had this whole river community living their lives as river people.
So where we're standing right now on this patchwork of old worn-down bricks and debris, which is empty, all the way along. It's low tide right now, and you can see all the way over to Tower Bridge. This would have actually been a thoroughfare. Without wanting to be nostalgic, there's loneliness now to the Thames.
I think you're right, but it does provide a sense of peace in a very busy city. People have the opportunity to pause and see a bit of nature, see an open sky and have a look to see how the river is doing.
A riparian riverbank way of life was still thriving in London on the 8th of July, 1969, when Dave Jessop was bound to his father as an apprentice Thames lighterman. He can trace his family's life on the river as lightermen who carry goods, watermen who carry passengers, and stevedores who unload on the docks, back to at least the 1750s. But these communities and trades go back hundreds of years before.
Dad was a lighterman. When I was 5, started to take me to work with him. Not very often at first. Sit there, don't move. As a boy, on the tug, coming up river during the night, you'd sort of fall asleep and you'd wake up and you could smell where you were. Different parts of the river had very distinctive, taking loads of sugar. Blackpool Reach was mollicine. And then when you started getting up into the pool, Butlers, you had the spices, the curry. Surrey Dock was timber in the softwood season, that smell. You just knew where you were, even in the fog. It became a part of your life. Ships and people speaking foreign languages. You always knew someone. Wherever you went in the docks, it was our home. I don't see what you see. I stand by the Angel and look up the river, and there's tugs and barges and boats, and it's just not there.
Do we pay enough attention to the River Thames?
No, we don't. Because we don't live our lives by the river in the way we used to in previous centuries. People don't understand the river and the importance it still has in our lives. 80% of our drinking water comes from the Thames and its tributaries. We need to get people to understand what the river's all about so that they're enjoying it, appreciating it, valuing it and saying, we've got to look after this. You see herons and cormorants, and they wouldn't be here if they weren't fishing the river. So it's fantastic to see the fish returning. And we do see the occasional salmon, but they've not really returned in the way that was hoped. And that's really because we still have these pollution issues today, where we've got sewage going into the River Thames on a weekly basis.
To help the Thames return to health, we have to develop a duty of care towards the river. And to care about rivers, we first have to know them. For Dave Jessop and hundreds of others, the river is still a liquid highway with a map of place names which are gradually being changed and forgotten. When the name of a place is forgotten, in a way it stops existing. But whilst Dave can still guide us east from Tower Bridge and the Upper Pool, these places live on.
You come from Tower Bridge, you'd have the entrance to St Catherine's or Quay Dock on the left, Butlers on the right, ships, barges, barge moorings. Dockhead. Yeah, then Chambers Wharf is on the right. On the left you had Orient Wharf, Colonial Wharf, Karen Wharf, British and Foreign. These have all gone. Then you have Oliver's, and then on the point there, that was Morocco Wharf, that was a jetty that did ships there. Then you go down to St John's and down into Wapping Mudhole, which they don't call it that anymore. There was thousands of barges. There'd be tugs chucking round, you know, and you could tell a tug by the whistle. They all sounded different. And you'd be coming upriver behind a particular tug, and you knew that they did a wharf that was up on the right-hand side. You got over a bit and give him a bit more space. That's how it was. Just people knew.
The river as a source of life and of connecting with the universe is hugely important in so many different religions. And people will come down to the river and meditate, come to look, come to talk, maybe to sing and to give thanks. Thames 21 does a lot of clean-ups of the river, and unfortunately you find lots of single-use plastic, but at the same time there are clay offerings going into the river too, especially if they're made from the mud of the river. That's amazing.
A little way down the Thames on the eastern edge of one of the river's great bends, Sourav Niyogi looks out from his home across the river in the heart of the old docklands. As a practicing Hindu, he has his own deep spiritual connection with the river.
I was born in India, in the wonderful state of Bengal, close to the river Ganges. The water from the river is considered as one that purifies the human being. People offer prayers with the water from the river and often in the river. You will see a huge number of temples and offering places all around the Ganges. Now, what happens when you are in the UK? You can't have access to the Ganges, and that's where Thames acts as a surrogate for the Ganges. Practicing Hindus uses the water from the Thames to actually go on with the rituals. And not only just the sort of water, but sort of the riverside forms an important place where some of these rituals take place, whether it's an early morning prayer or whether it's the start of Durga Puja. Durga Puja is one of the sort of major festivals. The goddess Durga and the deities are made out of mud and clay in Bengal. It's referring to the cycle of life, and it starts from the sort of river where mud and clay is collected from to make the deities, and it goes back to the river. One of the pujas in London did that a few years ago with the right sort of permissions. Just close to the Putney Bridge, an immersion was done. And you would see an idol made of clay and mud going into the river. An important part of prayers is actually making an offering to the river. I've heard stories around deities of Lord Ganesha and other deities being found in this river mud. And I'm sure you would see once in a while in the evening a bright light being floated into the river. Those kind of small clay pots where a little bit of oil is poured with a wicker being lit up. Across the rivers in India, they make a fascinating sight, but I've seen some of that also happen in and around the Thames. Water has a calming effect on me. I've loved living around the dock. After going through the hustle and bustle through the day and tough meetings and everything else, when I come back home, I just go to my balcony with a cup of tea and just look out at the river.
One thing that I really, really do remember is Mum and Dad would go out New Year's Eve, or Old Year's Night. I still call it Old Year's Night. And all the ships on the river blow their horns at midnight. And I can remember my nan holding me out on the landing, listening to all these steam whistles and ship's hooters and just, to blow the old year out. I still can't go anywhere where there isn't water. But to go out on the Thames, there's nowhere else in the world quite like it. You know in the first week, if you don't want to do it, you're not going to do it. But if you do it, you'll never, ever be away from it. You belong. It's that sense of belonging, and you do.
Have you ever heard tell how a young London waterman, who from Blackfriars did regular ply, and he feathered his oar
with such skill and dexterity, pleasing each maid and delighting each eye. And he sang so sweet, he sang so merry, the couples all jostled to hire his wherry, and he became known as the young lover's ferry. But he could not find a true love of his own.
Bob Roberts sings The London Waterman, carrying us on down the river towards the sea. Bob was one of the last sailing bargemen of the Thames. He was recorded singing this song, which dates back to 1774, some 200 years later, learned from his mother's repertoire of old Thames songs.
And they sing so sweet, they sing so merry, the couples all jostle to hire their wherry, and everyone goes by the Blackfriars Ferry, while he stays at home with a love of his own.
We're actually quite a distance from the land.
This is writer and artist Rachel Lichtenstein, a child of Essex's shoreline and estuary, that vast, mysterious and muddy delta, where the river spreads himself over a 5-mile-wide mouth of water and sky.
So we're actually 1.5 miles out to sea, on a former rubbish tip, to Tree Island, which has now become this wild nature reserve. And here to the left, there's, that's the kind of traditional salt marsh which would have been all along this coast.
Rachel spent 5 years on the shores and waters of the Thames, collecting stories and memories for her book, Estuary. She took me to the edge of the land, to the tip of a long slipway running out into the river.
A river is an ever-moving, changeable landscape. Where we're standing now and looking over at Canvey Island, a place which exists below sea level, which is this interchangeable tidal landscape. It's always had a bad press, but Canvey Island was the dream for Jewish EastEnders to buy a plot of land and come and build on it. And there's always been lots of EastEnders living there, so it's got this Cockney culture. Most recently, there's a large community of Hasidic Orthodox Jews that have moved down from North London, living on Canvey Island. So it's a very fascinating landscape that's embraced a lot of different communities and continues to shift and change. That point at Gravesend is where lots of people say is the end of the Thames River and the beginning of the estuary. You can also see just to the edge where the Thames estuary meets the mouth of the North Sea. And can you see the wind farms on the horizon?
We're going to be experiencing a great rising of the sea levels and this area being far more inundated. How does that feel for you to know that this might all not exist in only a few decades?
Where we're standing now would be the first of those places to disappear. And it's so poignant thinking about this and then looking out those giant container ships. They're only coming here because of our need for this stuff, which affects this landscape directly. It's a disappearing culture. Most estuarine dwellers on both sides don't actually know what happens on the river or what has happened. And that also relates to the mythology and the songs that are part of that story of this place. If you speak to any fisherman or any tugman, they'll all tell you ghost stories or stories of sea witches and mermaids. Water holds memory. We look at this sand beneath our feet and it's that constant movement of the water grinding up this landscape, and then all those shipwrecks, all the different elements of things to do with the trade on the river are all part of it. Trace elements are in the water, and every time you're gathering some of those stories, it's like dipping a cup into that well of stories and memory and lost landscapes. Shall we walk up to the end?
Yeah.
It will soon be covered by the tide here. Can you see that magical moment there where you've got a big container ship coming in just behind Canvey Island and it looks like it's floating on the island? At the mouth of the Thames estuary, that was once a strip of land, now known as Doggerland, that attached onto Europe. And it's this prehistoric lost landscape on the bottom of the Thames estuary.
Doggerland. It was a landscape inhabited by many communities and enormous number of species. Only over a few centuries disappeared, just went underwater, and this place is going to go the same way and enter into mythical knowing of people who saw it, and then eventually people who know people who saw it. Canvey Island. My grandmother used to speak about Canvey Island, this amazing place.
Yeah, you're right. It's places on the edges, and you can see it right in front of us. This is one of the last places on the Essex coast where you get this really old salt marsh, which will disappear within the next hour as the tide comes in.
I must be going, no longer staying. The burning Thames I have to cross. I must be guided without a stumble into the arms of my dear lass. And it's Willie dear, oh dearest Willie, whenever shall I see you again? When fishes fly, love, and the seas run dry, love, and the rocks they melt in the heat of the sun. Looking out across the estuary, I plunge my hands below the surface. Throughout the ages of the earth, these same water molecules I cool myself with have also quenched the thirsts of Boadicea, Mansa Musa, Julius Caesar and Amelia Earhart. They've passed through the baleen of ancient Miocene leviathans and the gills of all the salmon that ever lived in the Thames. There is a time map held within each drop. I imagine a time when things we've known along this river sink into myth, swallowed by the tide of the Anthropocene. Whatever becomes of the river, our resilience comes from knowing his many lives and finding dialogue between them. How can we become a more positive part of his course? How can we protect the Thames? If the Thames's water does indeed hold memory, let us reciprocate and remember all that he provides for us.
Hello again. You're back with Vanessa Kasile, and I really hope you enjoyed that documentary. Remember, there are 2 new documentaries every week, so check back soon for another seriously interesting podcast.
Hello, I'm Dr. Michael Mosley, and in my podcast, Just One Thing, I'm investigating some quick, simple and surprising ways to improve your health and life. From eating some dark chocolate, that was really good, to improve your heart, to playing video games, to enhance your brain power. Oh, God, yeah. I'd be slaughtered, aren't I? Or singing your favourite songs to bolster your